Okay, let's move on to Dr. Fauci. Just some more stuff that just crystallizes for all time how complicit he was, not only in the lab leak, in funding the Wuhan lab, but in covering up his own role and the implication that the COVID-19 virus did leak from the Wuhan lab. Let's put this up there on the screen. New emails, which were uncovered by a committee investigating the lab leak hypothesis, reveal that Dr. Anthony Fauci prompted and commissioned a final approval for a scientific paper, which we've covered here ad nauseum, in February of 2020 to disprove the theory that the virus had leaked from the lab. Now, why that is important is that just 2 months later, he stood at the White House podium and said that, quote, there was a study recently where a group of highly qualified evolutionary virologists looked at the sequences in bats as they evolve and the mutations that it took to get to the point where it is now totally consistent with a jump from species from animal to a human. So the paper will be available. I don't have the authors right now, but I can make it available to you. Why does that matter? Because he sent a final approval, editing in draft form, for that paper that was published in Nature magazine on February 17th, 2020. He then used that paper to actually tell his boss, the United States government, and the American people and the press that showed that the lab leak theory was thus disproven. Now, look, we've actually focused quite a bit on that February 17th paper. I've done a lot of monologues about the emails showing Christian Anderson and many of the other virologists who initially had believed that this was a lab leak and had not consistent with evolutionary theory, effectively being browbeat by Dr. Fauci, by Peter Daszak, by many of these other characters were involved to ultimately come out with this paper. The paper was then extraordinarily influential by the media, by the scientific establishment, by quashing any dissent as to how exactly COVID-19 might have come from the lab. And then we didn't find out for nearly 2 years until a FOIA investigation, and now these emails show you not only that Fauci knew in January that the virus was not, quote, not consistent with evolutionary theory, but that he actually commissioned the paper himself. He prompted the drafting of the publication. His hands are so dirty on this that it's difficult to even describe. And, you know, it's unfortunate because, of course, even you want to cover this. Who's the only outlet who's covering it? New York Post,
right.
Daily Call. You know, it's like it's only the conservative media. This is a huge story that people refuse to pick up on.
Yeah, but it goes against the narrative of Fauci, the saint, that has been peddled and continue to be peddled right up until his retirement with his own, you know, puff pieces in the New York Times, et cetera. And just to give you the details here, this paper was submitted to Nature Medicine with a cover email that read, there's been a lot of speculation, fear-mongering, and conspiracies put forward in this space. This paper was prompted by Jeremy Farah, Tony Fauci, and Francis Collins. So explicitly stating that the paper was prompted by Tony Fauci. And just to remind you of the timeline here, this paper, this letter drops 4 days after that initial conference call, when there were several, at least members of the call, who at least thought it was plausible that it came from a lab leak, in particular, and some who thought it was much more likely than not that it came from a lab leak. So it's mere days after this call that there's a marshaling of forces to destroy any semblance of that narrative and make it off limits for the press. And it worked as a cudgel incredibly effectively. He knew what he was doing. This was a set piece. He knew, okay, if we put out this letter and we have all of these scientists sign on to it, media doesn't really understand this stuff, then we hint to if the other theory is just conspiracy, it's just Trump talk, it's just, you know, racist, et cetera, then that will put any idea that this could have leaked from the lab off the table and no one will investigate it. And guess what? Almost no one did for quite a while. It was extraordinarily effective.
Right, and I think people need to remember, you know, with Christian Anderson, with many of the other people who were involved, you had Dr. Peter Daszak also use this paper and then thank them and then send it to Fauci and to other people in the scientific establishment to continue to quash it. By April, it was completely impossible to discuss the lab leak hypothesis in the public sphere. It was knocked down so quickly, doth protest a little bit too much then at the time. It was used to take Zero Hedge off of Twitter. It was obviously used as a censorship mechanism all over YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, many of the other social media platforms. And, you know, 3 years later, literally 3 years later, what do we know? It was almost certainly true. At this point, in my opinion, you're a conspiracy theorist if you don't think that it came from the lab, because there is just such little evidence to even back that up. Now, even the Energy Department, the FBI, have to admit that, yeah, it probably came from the lab. You have the former CDC director under Donald Trump, who came out years ago now, almost 2 years ago at this point. He's like, yeah, I think it came out of the Wuhan lab. Apparently, that was just not considered a influential enough figure to prompt investigation. And to this day, the only way that the mainstream media will cover it is, one segment we were going to do, Crystal, was about the Washington Post. And the Washington Post wrote this effective hit piece on the lab leak theory, where they're like, this little known department in energy is the one who is coming up with the idea that it came from the lab. That little known department, by the way, is tasked with overseeing safety of actual virology labs. So yeah, maybe they happen to know something about lab safety and about how to read intelligence about how this virus might have escaped from the Wuhan lab.
Yeah. Even beyond the censorship, which was obviously outrageous, the smearing of people who suggested there was something to this theory as, racist and xenophobic and all the rest, there was a real cost to putting people off the track for years, where, this was a critical time period when we could have had a better shot at getting to the bottom of what actually happened here, and we'll never get that time back. So there was a real scientific cost to this whole, what looks very clearly to me at this point like a conspiracy, to hide a potential possibility and reality from the American public and quash any potential debate or investigation in that direction.
Well said.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Sagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.